Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another Total War Warhammer 2 tier list. Now this time around, we are going to be examining the Forces of Chaos. Some of you might have noticed, especially if you're watching on computer, you will see that we are zooming in here. It was requested that I try to zoom in for those who are watching these videos on a phone, and hopefully this does make it a little more viewable, a little more watchable. If so, be sure to let me know down in the comments. I also am aware that we do have a patch incoming. Not entirely sure when this video will be coming out in relation to that patch, but from what I've seen of the patch, it looks like Chaos is not getting significant overhauls or significant changes. Most of their units seem to be sticking around the same point, both price as well as stat-wise, and so it's likely that the faction will most likely remain playing the same. And honestly, I expect Chaos to keep playing the same right up until Warhammer 3 drops, and they likely get their massive overhaul. Chaos is a faction that really has been playing the same essentially for basically all of Warhammer 2's life cycle. The addition of their Regiments for Renown spiced things up a little bit, but not a huge amount. None of them were really sort of the game changers that they had been for Chaos back in the days of Warhammer 1. A few units, there was some change going from Warhammer 1 to Warhammer 2, where some units such as Forsaken or Sigvald kind of fell off the bandwagon as far as power levels went. Units such as Chosen definitely moved up and became a little more competitive with the way the combat in Warhammer 2 was overhauled. And we saw fights dragging on much longer, HP pools for infantry being much higher. Charge bonuses being a little less significant, that sort of thing. So Chaos certainly saw some changes going from Warhammer 1 to 2, but nothing too insane. And really, throughout the life cycle of Warhammer 2, most Chaos build and meta changes have boiled down to responding to enemy changes. Because with all the new DLCs that have been pouring out, new factions being implemented, Chaos is not really seen its the tools available change, and so the builds have been forced to change to adapt to new resources available to enemies, whether that be the Black Lions in the more recent Empire patches, whether that was Vampire Coast, or whether that's Skaven Giselles, whatever it may be. Chaos has been forced to flex around it and try to work their way around with the tools they have. And besides that, most units that were strong kind of still are strong. Most units that started out weak honestly still kind of are weak. So without further ado, we are going to dive in. We're going to explore what makes Chaos tick, what units they've got that are good, what they've got that is bad, and just discuss the faction a little. So first and foremost, we do have Archaon, and the head honcho of Chaos, of course, the bringer of the end times, just insane madman, is going to land in B tier. Archaon would have earlier started out probably in like a C or a D tier. He really was not a good lord. He was called Archaon the Never Chosen for a reason. Very unpopular. Despite decent combat stats, he didn't have AP. He was relatively immobile because Dorgar was very slow. It was only 66 speed. He was incredibly expensive. His items were just not that strong. So all in all, Archaon was a bit of a lackluster Lord's choice. He's probably one of the only real changes I would say Chaos has had as far as sort of their meta or roster choices have come. The fact that Archaon got AP, the fact that Dorgar became more mobile, moving from 66 to 78 speed, the fact that the new AP, the reworked AP made Slayer of Kings a much more useful item to take on him. And of course the fact that he still has Crown Domination, which was a very strong item, has made Archaon a more competitive choice. His biggest downside by far is cost. He's just grossly expensive for a Firecaster that has no Arcane Conduit, and for a Combat Lord that struggles to really get the engagements he wants. Chaos isn't Tomb King, so where Cetra is in many ways similar to Archaon. He's got very high combat stats, he's a very solid fighting lord, and he has a decent lore of magic without the most insane wins of magic generation. The difference is that Cetra can play Backcatcher, he can play safe and cautious on a horse, sit in the back line, and protect shooting. Archaon's in Chaos. Chaos doesn't have much shooting, and what shooting they have is not likely to need protection because it can run away or fight its way out of anything by itself. Except the Hell Cannon, but that's a bit of a meme unit, really. So, yeah, Archaon struggles to really have an impact in combat. He doesn't have the mass to plow through and really get the engagements he wants. At the same time, he can't really bait the enemy to attack him or to come try to plow through his troops. And that definitely hurts him. That said, the immunity psychology from Crown of Domination means you can buff the troops around him a good amount. He is relatively tanky and relatively difficult to take down because he's a fairly small target, fairly mobile, has very high armor and combat stats, actually very high HP for a just simple horse lord. He's sitting in the 4,000s off the top of my head, and so he's relatively difficult to snipe. With Slayer of Kings, he can lay the smackdown on just about anybody who dares to try to fight him. So he's definitely no pushover. But at the same time, the high cost is a killer. The fact that you can't generate more Winds of Magic for him is a bit of a killer. And it definitely limits his usage. It doesn't help that some of the other Lords in the Chaos roster are just stupidly competitive. And we're actually going to get into some of those in just a second. But I would place Archaon at B tier. There are certain builds where he can shine, supporting Chosen against Terror Bombs, supporting weird units like Trolls against Terror Bombs, or roving around with Chaos Cavalry. There's different ways you can play him. He certainly can perform. If you want Lore of Fire and a Fighty Lord all in one, it's nice because Sorcerel obviously only has Lore of Metal, and the Lore of and the various Chaos Sorcerers are not as combat competitive as Archaon. So there are definitely niches for him, but I would certainly not rate him above B. Now Kolek, S tier. This barely needs any explanation. And despite what's essentially only been nerfs throughout the life cycle of Warhammer 2, Kolek hits like a truck. He dominates the large category. I don't think there's there's literally no large unit in his price range that he cannot beat the brakes off of. The only units off the top of my head that beat him somewhat consistently are the Dread Saurine and then the Shredder of Lustria, who cost far more than Kolek. Kolek's like 1,000 cheaper than the normal Dread Saurine with the Howdah. And Kolek barely, I think, loses. He actually might beat. I'm not entirely sure how, especially with some of the changes to the mass and the less distraction. I'm not entirely sure, but Kolek, I'm pretty sure either nearly or actually does beat the brakes off the normal Dread Saurine and just barely loses to the Shredder of Lustria. So he's insane. He'll beat the brakes off of a Krokar, even though it is a pretty close fight. Any lesser large unit just gets punted around and demolished. He is a beast. If he has downside, it's the fact that he's not a mage, so he's just pure fighty. And Chaos mages are not the greatest, so that hurts him a little bit. Second of all, his item Starcrusher is not the greatest. He does have Lord of the Storm, which allows him to summon or call down bolts of lightning, which are very strong against clumps of troops. But Starcrusher is kind of overpriced, or is not really an item you want. Yes, it makes Kolek hit harder, but it costs too much to really justify bringing it most of the time. But it doesn't matter. Kolek's S tier. Sorcerel is going to come in alongside him as also at S tier. Now, Kolek is a lord who you don't always want to bring against shooting factions. Factions, unless it's a very dense map, factions such as Empire, Vampire Coast, Wood Elves, factions like that will demolish Kolek because he's a large target. Granted, he has a narrow profile than some other monsters like the Dread Saurine, for example, or the Mammoth, but he is still a vulnerable large target. Sorcerel flips that on his head by having 50% missile resist. This was actually nerfed from what was previously 60%. Makes him a very difficult target to snipe down. Makes him very, very tanky. So Sorcerel's pretty beastly. He's also pretty resistant to magic damage. He's got 25% magic resist, I think, off the top of my head. So magic missiles do not do very much to him at all. He's unbreakable. He can cause fear and terror, which is, of course, very strong. He gets Arcane Conduit as well as full access to Lore of Metal. So he's actually a decent caster. His cost isn't too insane. He's kind of a fighty lord, not in the same category as someone like Archaon, much less someone like Kolek, but he can certainly beat down other casters and resist at least other fighty lords. And with his high mass and the good mobility, he can actually sort of plow through enemy lines, ping pong around, disrupt enemy back lines. He can shrug off a lot of missile fire and could just be an all-around beastly boy and really easily makes S tier, because if there's matches where you can't bring Kolek because of missiles, those are probably the matches where you bring Sorcerel just to tank, face tank, dodge, and be a general pain in the rear. He's just such a beast. He also synergizes really nicely with some of the non-AP Chaos options because he does provide you with Armor Sundering. So if you want to make Marauder Horsemasters or Horsemen work, if you want to make Chosen with Shields work, if you want to make Chaos Knights work, Sorcerel is a great support choice because he removes enemy armor and with Plague of Rust, and that can be very nice. It's a very nice synergy. Where Archaon Lore of Fire isn't necessarily a support lord. It's just a lore used to delete lots of units. And that's not a bad thing, but it is a limiting factor in comparison. Finally, we do have Prince Sigvald. Sigvald, in my opinion, is probably hovering between C and D tier. I'm actually going to drop him at C, because I don't think Sigvald's that bad. I know there's probably going to be some people who disagree, but in my experience, Sigvald's not terrible. The Geld Prince has really one gimmick, and one gimmick only, and that's survivability. He's got decent amounts of HP, very solid combat stats. Not great. Well, he does have good weapon strength, but he doesn't have AP weapon strength. Obviously, he's a foot character, so he's going to get punted around like a ragdoll. But he does have the auric armor, which allows him to regen and recuperate his HP over time. He's got a silver shield. He is pretty tanky. He can survive a long time. He is a sort of niche option against factions like Wood Elves or factions that are going to pressure you heavily with missile play. I still don't think he's worth it, to be honest, in most cases. I think generally sorcerers is just a more versatile option. But I wouldn't discount Sigvald. You can certainly make him work. If you're going for a super wide build, he's a decent choice. I think he's just been overlooked. I think part of it just boils down to shifting meta, and people don't give him as much credit as maybe they should. I certainly don't think he's as bad as some rate him. Now, moving on to Lord types, we do have the Chaos Lord. This guy, it's a little difficult for me to rate. Also hovering around C or D for me. I'm actually going to put him at D tier. He's workable. He's one of your only two Lord options that gets a Dragon mount. The other, of course, being the Chaos Sorcerer Lord, who's actually much better in my opinion. So the only ways you can get a Dragon. The problem is that Chaos is not good at air builds. You've got your only options, which are hamstrung even more in the current meta, or in the current match restrictions, where you can only get 3 single entity unit flyers. He's kind of crippled. You can't really bring a strong Chaos Air Force. Your best bet is like this guy on a dragon, and then 2 heroes on Manticores, but that just doesn't really work that well. Chaos doesn't have the firepower of someone like Dwarves or Empire to protect their air force, so it's a bit of a gimmicky Lord option. If you bring him on horse or foot, he's basically just a worse Sigvald or just a worse Archeon, or on horse he doesn't have too many peers. He's just kind of bad. He's a lackluster Lord. It's kind of like an Empire General. He does have some cool items. He's got the Filth Mace, which does grant him poison. He does have I believe it's the Sigil of Slash, which improves his offensive stats. But really, the guy's not the greatest. Just doesn't synergize too well with the Chaos roster. Just doesn't provide support. He doesn't provide magic, and he's nowhere near the same ballpark as some of the other fighty options. If you want a tank, if you want a dirt cheap tank, you got Sigvald. If you want a fighty Lord option, you got Kolek, you got Archeon. And honestly, even Sarthoriel and the Sorcerer Lord are close enough in combat prowess to where they compensate for any lack they have with their magic. Next up, we do have the Sorcerer Lord. And this guy, you might be wondering how I recognize it. I only recognized it because of where I got the images from. They almost all look the same. But the Chaos Sorcerer Lord is, in my opinion, also a B tier. Actually leaning more towards it. I actually normally put this guy above Archeon, I think. But it's a bit of a tight fight. If you want a budget caster option, this guy's the way to go. Pretty mobile on a horse. He does have the Blasted Standard, which can give you some pretty memey or funny strats. You can combo it with Chosen to get golden shields on him, which is funny. Not necessarily a competitive option, but it is fun. He does allow you to bring a cheap caster with Arcane Conduit and some good lore selection. Lore of Death, Shadows, Metal, and Fire. All very strong lore choices, and he's not a pushover in melee. Certainly he's not going to win you any beauty contests. He's not going to sort of beat the brakes off of a dedicated fighting lord. He's definitely not up to par even with Sarthoriel, but he can hold his own, or at least for a little while. He's not going to just roll over and die like some other caster lord options. It's not like a goblin great shaman who gets caught out and he's dead. It's not that tier of weakness. So, in my opinion, easy B tier. Just the fact that it's a cheap caster option. Even though he's nothing special or nothing unique, he's kind of like the Prophetess for the Bretonnians. He lets you go wide. He can support a wide variety of units because he can bring different types of magic to the field to fulfill different needs, and just a fun lord option in general, in my opinion. And that does bring us on to heroes, and well, there's not much to discuss there. There's only 2 of them. One is the Chaos Sorcerer, who in my opinion is actually a C tier. I actually think this guy's pretty terrible. He is a fighty caster, which is nice. The problem is his mount options are not great. It's either a Manticore or a horse. Now, like we just mentioned, flying builds are not great for Chaos because you only bring 3 single entity flyers, which means any opponent that invests in Air Force is going to outnumber you because they can bring 5 flying units where you can only bring 3. And chances are they can bring better single entity flyers than you can. So that's kind of limiting. He's a passable fighter, but it's not like you want to be throwing him into the fight. One of the biggest downsides, he does have the same magic lores as the normal Sorcerer Lord, but he has no Arcane Conduit, and his only way of getting Winds of Magic is Forbidden Rod. On the Necromancer for Vampire counts, that's really strong, because Necromancer regens. On this guy, it is just murdering your overpriced Sorcerer. You're basically committing suicide to try to generate more Winds of Magic, so you basically don't bring the Forbidden Rod, and you accept the fact that your Winds of Magic is limited. Now, you have to bring this guy if you want to bring Cole, or you almost have to. I know somebody will say that you don't always have to bring a Sorcerer. I've said so myself before, so I can't critique that necessarily, but you should try to bring a Sorcerer most of the time. And so you almost have to bring him with Kolek, Sigvald, or the Lord. He's just stupidly expensive. It's much like the Vampire Caster for Vampire Coast, or the Vampire Cast, or the Vampire Heroes for the Vampire Counts. It's just such an expensive caster option, and really drags him down. You don't get amazing mount options. You don't get great Winds of Magic generation. You get some decent lores and some fighting, but it's really not worth it. This guy's honestly hovering C to D tier as far as casters go in my book. And then we do have the Exalted Champion, and this guy is also a bit awkward. Now, I have gotten a bit more appreciation for him over the last few months, just from playing a bit of Chaos and experimenting with this guy as a sort of filler option. He has decent combat stats, I will say that, and he can be a surprisingly disruptive force. One of the things Chaos doesn't have is mid-tier cavalry. They have light cav, a skirmish cav, which can function as a combat light cav, and they do of course have their Chaos Knights. But there's this massive gap in between that where they just don't have a unit filling that. So you can use an Exalted Champion as a disrupting force, where you bring one cheap with nothing on him, and just bring him on a horse, throw him into a backline, and he can disrupt units like Jezzails, disrupt units like artillery, potentially support against enemy lords, that sort of thing. Certainly not the most amazing character, probably hovering more towards even D tier maybe, but I do think he has a slight niche there, and he can certainly shine in a handful of matchups if used correctly. Unfortunately, he's just very pricey. He doesn't get AP, so his damage output is often limited, despite the fact that he can get Mark of Khorne, as well as, I forget what blade it is. I know it gives him fire damage and improves his damage stats, but unfortunately, he's just not that good. Just a D tier for me. I almost always, if I bring him stripped down into matchups like Skaven, where he's really, really good against Skaven weapons teams. But besides that, definitely very limited. And it hurts, and it's kind of unfortunate. You'd think that he should be super powerful, because it's Chaos we're talking about. And they're all about their champions of the Dark Gods. And with that, we are going to move on to the Infantry. And, well, Infantry is a bit of a mixed bag, I would say. So they've got some really outstanding examples and some not so outstanding ones. Marauders, in my opinion, is stable B tier. If you're trying to generate extra width, these guys are your go-to. They actually, you know what? I'm actually even going to put them in as far as A, because they're almost a mandatory unit in most Chaos builds. If you want to generate width, these guys are your go-to. If you're looking to go for a wide spammy build, these guys are your go-to. If you just want some fodder to throw in the grinder, these guys are your go-to. They're not the most amazing combat unit. Their biggest benefit is the fact they are nippy. They're pretty quick for a foot melee unit. At 35 speed, they can close the gap pretty quickly. They do have bronze shields. They are decent combatants, though they don't get rage like Norscan Marauders, which certainly limits their usefulness. But yeah, they can definitely beat the brakes off of a lot of cheaper infantry. They can trade efficiently into a lot of cheaper infantry, like Empire Swordsmen, for example, and trading into something like Eternal Guard or High Elf Spears, whatever. They can do you proud. Maybe not amazing. Maybe they won't win all those fights, but they'll do well enough. And I think for that, they deserve an A tier here. Basically, any wide Chaos build is going to bring some Marauders. So it's actually going to be incredibly rare that you see build Chaos has without Marauders. These guys could, I'm sure you could even argue for these guys being S tier, just because of how common they are, even though their stats are not necessarily the most amazing. Now, Marauders with great weapons, these guys used to be pretty good, especially in certain matchups like Empire, where they traded well into great swords, for example. Personally, I'd rate these guys as low as D tier. I'm really not a huge fan. For me, they're somewhere between C and D. If I feel generous, they go C. Personally, I just don't like them, and I'd put them at D probably, like for my own usage. But I know some people think these guys are good, and I have seen some decent arguments for how to use them against dwarves, for example. If they're used correctly, they can shine. They can provide some support against large armored targets, and they can certainly give you more width if you're instead of going with a narrow death ball. And you want a little more oomph than generic marauders, these guys can sort of help. Also, while they often don't trade better than marauders against certain targets, they will kill stuff faster, which can be a benefit. But generally, they're just overpriced in my opinion. I think I'm going to move them to... It's tough for me to say, but I really don't think better than D tier is really worth... These guys really worth more than D. I don't know. I'll leave them at C for now. We'll see. I'll see how I feel about the other units, but these guys just do not shine, and I struggle to justify them, and it's unfortunate, but it is what it is. Similarly, Forsaken, and these guys used to be sort of the kings of Chaos rosters. They were sort of the unit a lot of Chaos players brought into many matchups because they just deleted squishy infantry. No longer. The higher HP pools in Warhammer 2, the fact that Forsaken did not get a boost to their model count, where even War Dancers, for example, went from 60 to 75 models, which made them significantly more efficient. These guys did not. These guys got stuck at 60 models. They are pretty flimsy, relatively low HP, very low armor for higher end Chaos Infantry. At only 75, so they get destroyed pretty quickly by even non-AP missiles or melee, and kind of like Source Warriors on speed. They just move fast, but they're otherwise a lot like Source Warriors with no sustainability. So it's just tough. I really struggle to justify these guys. Much like Marauders, I don't think, in my experience, these guys don't rate better than a C. Probably closer to a D. These units, I'm going to move both of them to D. They're just not that good. There are a few niche situations where you can use them to generate a little more width. They can provide a shock force in certain matchups. If you catch your opponent by surprise, these guys can do a lot of damage very quickly. And that's really their one saving grace. So if you hit a really squishy line, you can potentially bust it very quickly and then plow through, get onto the squishy units. And because these guys have very high speed, they can compromise backlines efficiently. But definitely no better than a C tier for me. And I'm going to put them at D. Unfortunately. Now then we do have Chaos Warriors. These guys are, in my opinion, very good. I'm going to put them at A tier alongside Chaos Marauders. I think they are very strong. Honestly, all three Chaos shielded units are incredibly strong. They are all very good. And Chaos Warriors are just, you get 100 armor, you get high HP pools, silver shields, very stable combat stats, sort of decent in sustained combat, decent on the charge. They'll trade okay even into better units just because they can endure for so long. Fairly high leadership. There's just very little that's bad about them. The biggest downside is their speed. But even against some armored factions like dwarves, I actually do like using these guys because the shields let them close much more efficiently than unshielded units, such as great weapons. So I really do like these guys. They are a very strong unit. There's few units that they do not grind down in the long fight, and so they easily net that A spot. Really, the only reason I don't put them higher, probably, and it's kind of extends to Marauders as well, is that with Chaos you've got different builds, and you'll cherry pick your shielded infantry to suit the build. And there are some exceptions. I think, for example, the Mirror Garden, we'll get to those, are almost an auto pick or very close to one, but in general you will cherry pick your shielded infantry to match your specific playstyle and build, and so that's why these guys are not netting slightly higher. Next up, we do have Chaos Warriors with great weapons. These guys would have been an S tier probably a little while ago, and I know some people still swear by them. However, personally, I'm not that enthralled with Chaos great weapons. In my opinion, they're a bit overrated. They could still trade well into a lot of targets, but the lack of shields is a killer. It's something a lot of people underestimate, and I've seen a lot of players get wrecked for it. They just think that 100 armor is going to be enough to compensate, and then it's not, because they just get gunned down. Factions really factions such as Empire, for example, where these guys used to be a good trade against great swords, while at the same time being decent against Cav. It is a little more difficult to justify these guys now because they just get gunned down so easily by the masses of shooting that Empire can bring. Against dwarves, with a lot of the snares that were implemented for dwarves have a much easier time sort of slowing these guys down, blocking them off. I still do think they are better than Chosen Great Weapons and far better than Marauder Great Weapons because they hit that nice mid tier. Their armor, they're essentially kind of like budget Black Orcs. Their armor allows them to tank a decent amount. They've got decent enough weapon strength, decent enough melee attack, good charge bonus. They'll butcher a lot of non-AP armored units, but I think A tier is really where they kind of belong. And it sounds like the way I'm talking about these guys, you'd think they'd be terrible, but they're not. They're just a bit niche. They are certainly better than almost any, if not every other great weapon unit in the game, for their price point especially. But I do think they are a little more niche than they used to be, where before you would basically bring them in any build. Now I think you don't want to bring them in every matchup. And even in matchups where you'd think they should be strong, like dwarves, they're a little limited in use. Finally, we do have Chaos Warriors with halberds. And these guys, I'm going to give a C tier to. I know some people are very fond of them. I know some people use them in a lot of matchups. I don't think they're really that good. They're not the all-arounders that Chaos Warriors with great weapons are, for example. These guys will do good against anything. Infantry, cavalry, monsters, whatever. Halberds will do well against cavalry. Against monsters, they have the usual issue of just not being able to get us around, not being able to get hits in. They just get kind of blocked up. Chaos doesn't really have a backline to protect, so really you need your infantry to be able to trade really well into enemy infantry while at the same time holding off large. Because all your investment is your front line, essentially, with maybe a few skirmishing elements. That's usually Chaos builds. I'm not saying that's every build. I know somebody can say, oh, there's Hell Cannon builds. Yeah, there are. I know. There's also Marauder Horseman builds. And honestly, some of these are strong builds. But generally, it's all about the front line fight. In that situation, if you want a halberd unit, Chosen halberds are way better than Chaos Warrior halberds as a stable anchor against the handful of factions where you are going to go with a halberd death ball. And I think in general, if you just need a little extra width, you're better off with great weapons instead of halberds. And you just don't really need that backline defense. If you want backline defense, you've got monsters, cav, dogs, and honestly, Marauder horsemen for that. They'll do a much finer job, in my opinion. Unless you're literally playing a Hell Cannon game. Now, I completely forgot about them. Aspiring Champions, a bit of a meme pick. I'm going to give these guys, I think I'll give them a D tier. I've actually had some success and some fun with some very memey Vanguard builds. These guys' combination of perks and abilities is kind of hilarious. They can do a surprising amount of hurt. They can hold surprisingly well. They can really anchor a line. You're almost never going to bring more than one of them unless you're memeing with a Vanguard build. Realistically, the unit is just not worth it in most cases. The HP is just too low. They're very susceptible to enemy heroes. They're very susceptible to enemy artillery fire. They're very susceptible to shooting even, despite their silver shields, because their HP is just too low. And they are a 550 gold unit. So while they can certainly come in as a surprise pick and do some damage, disrupt backlines potentially, because they're pretty quick. I believe they get 35 speed, so they're not slow. They can synergize well with Marauders. Ultimately, they are a bit of a niche filler, much in the same way as Forsaken and Marauders are, even though I am personally more fond of these guys than either of these two units. Finally, we do have Chosen, the creme de la creme of the Chaos roster. And first and foremost, we do have Chosen with shields. And some of you may disagree with this, but I'm going to put them at A tier. And honestly, with how much I love to use these guys, for me, they're almost an S tier. But I think these guys are stellar. 60% shield block, top tier stats. These guys outtrade every single unit in the game except their Great Weapon Brethren and Swordmasters off the top of my head. I think they beat literally every other unit. I think they even beat Phoenix Guard. Though actually, that's one I haven't tested, so that might be interesting. But I believe they beat Phoenix Guard, and they beat units like Temple Guard. They beat units like I believe Hargan Executioners, Black Orcs, Hammers. All those units actually get beaten down by these guys because their stats are just so monstrous. 60 melee defense, over 40 weapon strength, over 40 melee attack. They're just amazing. They are vulnerable to focus fire, but because they are 1250 gold infantry other than 1400 or 1450 like halberds or great weapons, they're not. And they have shields. They're not as easy to focus fire. they there are very few matchups where these guys are genuinely a bad option. They will essentially chew through any front line you put them up against, and that makes them incredibly valuable. There are a few niche matchups where you don't necessarily want them, but I think oftentimes, even if you just bring one of these guys, it can be enough to stabilize an entire front to win you specific points on the enemy front line and then break through. And if you combine them with like Sorcerer to get that extra bonus, the Plague of Rust going, these guys just become absolute murder monsters. But really, they're just a very strong unit, just provide a stupidly good anchor. And while other chosen variants can provide some niche benefits, these guys are just, in my opinion, all-around MVPs. There's almost no matchup where I think you can't make these guys work. Actually, I think you, depending on map especially, you can probably make these guys work in any matchup. And even in unfavorable open maps, for example, they can perform versus the majority of factions. That's how strong of a unit I think they are. Now, chosen halberds, I think, are a bit more niche. I'm actually going to put them at C tier. And I'm maybe B. No, I'll put them at B because they are very strong. I say very strong is a little bit of an iffy one. But they are pretty strong in the vampire count matchup. Now, this is a very bad matchup for Chaos to begin with. But these guys do provide the AP and anti-large to help fend off Terrorgeist, to help fend off units like Blood Knights, stuff like that. These guys do provide a little bit of an anchor there. They will outtrade units like Graveguard or Graveguard Great Weapons if your opponent is feeling ballsy and feels like using those. They can perform in matchups such as Lizardmen still, despite some of the changes to the Lizardmen roster. These guys can still do a good job there. They'll still outtrade units like Temple Guard. And lay the smackdown on big monsters pretty efficiently, or at least perform an anchor. Against factions like Bretonia, these guys are just nightmare incarnate. Bretonia is an incredibly bad time against these guys because you just park Kolek on them, and anything Bretonia throws at you is getting bludgeoned to a bloody pulp and probably dying. They're incredibly strong in the Bretonia matchup. So, yeah, B tier, in my opinion. I was going to put them at C initially, but then I thought about it, and definitely that would be wrong. I think B. They're very strong in a handful of matchups, just not good overall. Out of the 15 matchups in the game, you would probably take these guys in like 4 or 5 of them, in my opinion. Now, Chaos chosen great weapons, I would put at a C tier. I think they're definitely very niche as far as the chosen go. They do hit like trucks. They do outtrade, I believe, all infantry, with Swordmasters being a very tight fight. It's a very close. It's neck and neck. I know there have been tests before where, and a lot of it depends on unit width. If the chosen get their full charge off, I believe they trade better into Swordmasters, whereas units are narrower and the Swordmasters get more benefit from martial prowess. They can win. It's a bit of an iffy fight, but chosen with great weapons crush basically everything. They're an all-rounder unit. The problem is they're very vulnerable to focus fire. They're very expensive at 1450 gold, so while they can perform exceptionally well, they generally don't get the opportunity to do so. Most opponents will not give you worthy opponents to that make Chaos Great Weapons worthwhile. In the handful of matchups where these guys can work, like Dwarves, for example, it's still a bit of a tough sell. Against Dwarves, bringing a single chosen Great Weapon means you essentially gave up on 2 Chaos Warriors, for example. Or the Mirror Guard and Chaos Marauder Great Weapons or something like that. It's a huge loss cost. It means you have far less coverage. You cannot envelop your opponent as effectively. And if you're looking for Death Star against certain factions like Vampire Counts and Bretonia, halberds are better. They're a better anchor. And if you want sort of a single key unit to just lead the way and break the enemy lines over time, chosen with shields are better. Sword and axe, or axe and shield chosen are better. Great weapons just sort of sit in limbo. You can make them work. They will outtrade Black Orcs with WoW. They can certainly deliver. They are beasts. And I do not intend to underplay just how strong they can be, but especially the vulnerability to focus fire to enemy magic and artillery limits them, in my opinion, to C tier at best. And they might even be leaning towards D tier depending on how exactly you play. Certainly viable, and that's actually one thing I would like to emphasize here, that all of the Chaos units, as far as I'm concerned, thus far, are viable, and actually maybe even completely are viable, but some are definitely much less useful than others. Now, that does wrap up our generics, but of course, then we do have some regiments of renown. Well, really only one. We do have the Mirror Guard, and these guys are, in my opinion, actually going to get S tier. I don't think there's a single match where these guys are genuinely bad. They're incredibly fast, 38 speed, silver shields, immunity psychology, top tier stats. Stats that are not quite on par with Chosen, but they are cheaper by quite a wide margin. And Sigval's bodyguards are just amazing. Against a lot of factions where you're worried about shooting, these guys can gap close. They can breach a line and overrun the back line quickly. And they will crush cheaper infantry underfoot much more efficiently than Marauders, for example. Marauders trade okay with Empire Swordsmen, but they're not going to win super quickly. They're not even going to win super quick against Empire Spears, for example. So the Mirror Guard will. They will crush Empire State Troops underfoot. Trade pretty well into greatswords. If you hit the greatswords with like Plague of Rust, they'll demolish them. And they are pretty cheap. I think there are not many, if any, matchups where they really can't work. Even against like Vampire Coast or dwarves, for example, I think they can work. And you might say, why do dwarves? These guys don't have AP, but it doesn't matter really. Against dwarves, you want swarminess really, and numbers, and you want numbers and speed to overrun the backline. And these guys have it. It's actually more difficult to overrun the backline with like Chosen or Chaos Warriors, who are so much slower than it is with the Mirror Guard. So something to keep in mind. And I think they are worthy of an S tier. They're just such a good unit in my eyes. And the other one who I basically forgot about are the Demon Spew. I'm actually going to give them a C tier. I think they are a bit more viable than normal Forsaken. Cloud of Flies provides debuff to enemy melee attack, allows them to support your front line. They have poison while being a much more stable unit than your only other poison dealers. Well, actually, there are two poison dealers. You've got your Chaos Lord, who's just not a good lord choice, and then you have Poison Warhounds, who route at the drop of a hat. So Demon Spew are a nice support option. They're not too expensive. They will dumpster cheap infantry, and they provide this supporting aura. That said, I don't think they're worth more than a C tier. They're still an incredibly niche unit. They suffer from the same disadvantages as Chosen or as Forsaken while being more expensive. They're just very flimsy. Not great against armor, low model count, just overall have a lot of issues. But I think that their utility abilities, the poison, as well as Cloud of Flies, are worth at least something, and I think it makes them a better pick than Forsaken. If you're going to bring a single high-speed unit that's not Mirror Guard, then these guys are probably the way to go. Which does get us on to Skirmish Cav. And Skirmish Cav is, well, pretty straightforward in my opinion. Marauder Horsemen are, in my opinion, B tier. At one point I would have put them higher, but they have taken some successive nerfs, cost nerfs, ammo nerfs. Now I would put them at B tier. Still a very potent cavalry force. They can still act as a pseudo light cav. They still can, with support from sorcerers, do a lot of damage against, or with support of Lord of Metal, do a lot of damage to armored targets. Even honestly, they even against armored targets without Lord of Metal, they do have 7 AP per attack, which is pretty strong. They can definitely do some good poke damage. A staple in some ways of Chaos Harass, but personally I think Marauder Horsemasters and Horsemen with throwing axes are generally better. You'll find, I think, more utility out of these units than you will out of these guys. So they are going to land a B tier. I think they are the weakest right now of the Chaos Marauder Horsemen options. Now, next up, we do have Marauder Horsemen with throwing axes. These guys get shields, which is interesting. They're the only skirmish cav I can think of. I believe they are the only skirmish cav in the game that has shields, which is, besides obviously their Norscan counterparts, which is interesting. That's cool in my opinion. It means they can tank missiles better than you would expect. They can really chip away at elite enemy armored cav. They can be great harass force. If you need to deal with big monsters and you don't necessarily have the and you don't necessarily want to bring Shaggoths, or you're worried about bringing Shaggoths. For example, against Empire, you don't necessarily want to bring Shaggoths to counteract enemy heavy cap, but you need something. You can't just concede the field to Demigrave Knights and Reichsguard, Knights of the Blazing Sun. And there are various ways to do that, of course. It's not just Marauder Horsemen with throwing axes, but they are a very strong option. These guys will counteract Empire skirmish play for most part, barring Pistoliers, really. Even Pistoliers they can counter okay. And they will counter enemy heavy cav incredibly effectively. They will counter Demigrave Knights for example, very, very well. They will counteract enemy lords if they land. They will counter them pretty well. They can just throw hatchets at them until they die. And they can disrupt backlines if your opponent goes static. So very nice. They can support against dwarves. Really, the biggest downside is just slow projectile velocity. Makes them liable against flyers. They're not great against flying units, but still an A tier in my opinion. Horsemasters right alongside them. The OG hybrid cav. Like, these guys are basically Lyrian Reavers without martial prowess, but and without range, but instead you get, or without long range, but instead you get some disgustingly powerful javelins. They've actually gotten buffed in the last few patches. They have a great charge bonus, really can devastate enemies on the charge. Even pretty good cav. If you get like a rear charge, cheeky rear charges against enemy heavy cav, much less a charge against exposed foot troops, these guys will do work. They are no pushover. And I absolutely love Horsemasters. For me personally, these guys would be an S tier, but I think A tier is fair, especially because Horsemen with throwing axes are so strong. And because I have put some top tier units here in A tier, who also in my mind would be an S tier, I think it was only fair that I keep these guys at A. But just such a strong unit, can really chip away at elite targets, synergize stupidly well with Plague of Rust, good in melee, good in range, and only 750 gold. Just a great unit overall. I love these guys. Can't get enough of them. There's almost, I don't know if there's many, if any, chaos builds I run that do not involve at least a handful of Horsemasters. They can defend themselves against enemy like cav. It's just so good. And I'd waste this video just talking about how good these guys are, but I love them. Love them to bits. Then we do have, I guess we can go into heavy cav and then chariots, or we can do chariots and heavy cav together. Chaos chariots, going to go with a B tier for this one. They're not bad. They can certainly disrupt backlines. Pretty nippy, decently armored, cheap, very cheap in fact, 750 for such a well-armored chariot. That's important. No AP. They're not the most amazing chariot, of course, for raw damage output, but just for how cheap they are, for how disruptive they are, they can be very strong and essentially carry you in certain matchups. I'm not a big chariot player, so if you guys disagree and you think these guys should be higher, just let me know. I don't use them very often, and it really boils down to my playstyle. I'm not a good chariot player. I'm not a person who enjoys using chariots for most part, and so I don't use them. That's what it boils down to. But I think that these guys are still a very useful unit from what I've seen other players do. I've seen people do some really good stuff with them, and I think that B tier is very fair. And yeah, against any sort of, if you're dealing with a campy opponent, these guys can plow through. You're not worried about losing them too much because they are so cheap. They can plow through, disrupt enemy backlines, and be just a menace to society. Now, Gorby's chariot is a chariot I've actually used a decent amount myself in some kitey builds against greenskins especially. But I will actually rate it lower than the Chaos chariot because it is expensive. It's a 1200 gold chariot, and it's slow. It's actually pretty easy to shut down because of how slow it is. Now, you do get AP, you do get tankiness, you've got decent combat stats, all this stuff. Very strong charge bonus. It's better in almost every way than the normal Chaos chariot, but it is slower, which is a downside. And it is just more expensive. It's so much. You essentially you could almost get 2 Chaos chariots for the price of a single Gore Beast. That's not quite true, but yeah, like a Chaos chariot and Marauder Horseman with throwing axes for the price of a single Gore Beast, which is honestly a better investment probably than a single Gore Beast in most cases. These guys can run shop on enemy infantry. They will devastate enemy infantry. They are the best multi-model anti-infantry chariot or AP chariot in the game, in my opinion. Honestly, I'd even rate them better. Like, Doomflayers are strong, but Doomflayers are definitely do struggle from lower melee attack and sort of lower survivability maybe than Gore Beasts, even though they obviously Doomflayers are very strong against missiles. But in the pure infantry killing role, I think Gore Beasts are probably the strongest chariot in the game. The problem is that they just get shut down by shooting, shut down by enemy cav. You're not Skaven, so you can't sort of approach your opponent's not going to bring the builds that you can really bully with them necessarily. When you just need to disrupt backlines quickly, a cheap chariot is better than an expensive one. And not many factions are going to try to go toe-to-toe with you in an elite infantry fight. So you don't necessarily need the Gore Beasts. 1 or 2, or maybe if you're trying to kite, for example, orcs, these guys can be very good. And that's why I'm putting them at C. But yeah, they're definitely a bit limited. Now, then we do have the actual heavy cav. We've got Chaos Knights, who I love. Chaos Knights without lances. I will put them at B tier because I think I have a bias towards these guys because I really like how cheap they are. I often like to save that 100 gold and use it for something else with Chaos, and I often bring Chaos Knights in pairs or even 3s or 4s sometimes. I like some Chaos Knight heavy builds. In that case, saving a little money goes a long way. But the fact of the matter is, these guys do not have the great charge bonus of Chaos Knights with Lances. You can't just drop a Plague of Rust and delete a unit of, say, Demigryph Knights even, the way you can with Lances. But I do think that in matchups like Wood Elves, where the charge bonus doesn't matter that much, in certain matchups like that, these guys really can shine. They can really be a disruptive force, a good harassing force. They can hold the line for you for a really long time, just bounce around. They're a good support tool. And I think they deserve a B tier. I think they are grossly underrated, and I think a lot of people just underestimate how good these guys can be. Mostly because they just rely on more monsters with Chaos, which is fine, but I think they do deserve a B tier just because of how solid they are. B, maybe leaning towards C, but still a very strong unit. Chaos Knights with Lances, I want to give them an A, honestly. The reason being is that these guys, well, I say A, but now I think about it, I know there's going to be other, no, there's some better units that are going to go S. I actually like these guys. I think they're very strong, and I've given the spot to Chosen, which are a bit of a finicky pick. I like Chaos Knights with Lances. They need support, and that's, I think, one of the big reasons people don't use these guys or don't like to use these guys, because they take a lot of, in my opinion, micro or by Chaos standards and a lot of cohesion to work. You need to provide them with magic support. You need to provide them with hound support. You need to position them correctly. You need to choose your fights carefully, and it's difficult with a slow heavy cav. But I think they are very strong. The charge bonus, the sustained combat stats for shock cav are top tier. Their charge bonus is disgustingly strong. 120 armor is insane. They will delete a lot of units on the charge. You drop a Plague of Rust, these guys will demolish Demigryph Knights. They are no slouches. In my opinion, are grossly underrated by a lot of people. So I'm actually going to put them at A tier. I just love these guys. I really like my Chaos Knights, especially combined with Sorcerers and Armor Sundering. The biggest disadvantage is that without support, these guys fall flat. They actually lose to the majority or trade somewhat inefficiently with most other elite cav. They're not great against enemy cav by themselves. And this is, I think, one of the big downsides to them and one of the reasons people don't like them. Demigryph Knights by themselves, or Demigryph Knights Halberds, sorry, by themselves will trade really well. Horned ones by themselves will trade really well. Grail Knights, of course, by themselves will trade really well, as will Blood Knights. All those heavy cav options will trade really well into enemy cav. Chaos Knights with Lances, not necessarily. They will lose pretty hard in a lot of those matchups. And so because of that, I'm going to... I do think that's one restrictive factor on them. I think that's why people don't like them, but I think A tier is fine as long as you support them correctly. They're a very high babysit, highly in need of babysit unit with potential for good results. And finally, we do have the Swords of Chaos, and these guys are a bit of a difficult pick. I haven't used them very much. I've used them some, but not a lot since they were reworked. I do think they're a C tier. Despite the fact that they are better than they were, they still don't have many matchups where you really want to bring them. If you want an AP low model count unit, you're probably going to bring Dragon Ogres or Dragon Ogre Shaggoths to counteract enemy large, which is really usually what you need to counter. These guys still don't trade super well into enemy heavy cav, so especially given how expensive they are at 1800, so they're not cheap. With fire damage, they're, for example, garbage against elves, or high elves, sorry, who have fire resist on Dragon Princes, which makes these guys terrible. They fight. They're kind of like Chaos Knights with AP that cost a lot more, and incidentally, it works out where you'd much rather just have the cheaper knights and support them with a little armor sundering than have the expensive knights that come with AP themselves. In my opinion, by not bring these guys and just bring normal Chaos Knights, you can save money and get an extra unit of Marauders on the field, which is really what you need usually as Chaos. You need that extra width. And I think that hinders these guys. That said, they can be used in niche situations. They can help contain enemy monsters, especially if you go with a wider build where you're looking to pepper away at your opponent with Marauder Horsemen and that sort of thing. They can certainly perform. Against Tomb Kings with their fire damage, they are pretty strong. So, and honestly, against Wood Elves, they're also pretty strong. Fire helps. So definitely not a pushover. They do synergize okay with Kindle Flame. So they've got their niches, but I think C is probably fair. Which does bring us on to... We'll actually do monsters last, because Hell Cannon is just one thing. Hell Cannon, vanilla Hell Cannon is, in my opinion, a D tier, leaning even towards F. I don't think it's very good at all. Low ammo count, incredibly inaccurate, or I should say inaccurate, but unreliable if you don't direct control it. If you direct control it, it can be God tier, but it takes direct control, and that's actually a sort of micro that is often unacceptable or difficult to pull off, even by top tier players. So I just don't think this unit is usually worth it. And if you're going to bring a Hell Cannon for real, you're going to bring the Soul of Damnation, which I think is a C tier. It's not even that good anyway, but having 15 more ammo and rank 9 veterancy means it's as well as an ability that increases rate of fire as your opponent gets closer, makes it a much more valuable choice. It means you can at least get some damage out. However, both units suffer from being incredibly easy to counter battery, so anybody who can counter battery is going to. Being expensive, being near worthless against single entities. Despite the homing shots, they just don't really perform there. Yeah, and being very micro-intensive if you want to get maximum value out of these guys. And it really hinders the unit, despite potential to be great. So it really boils down to maps. There are certain maps where you can pull off some nasty things, but essentially these guys are a lot like Queen Bess, a very meme unit. Even not a... it's just a meme unit. It's what it comes down to. Not good, not terrible. Bit of a meme. Which does lead us on to monsters. And there's quite a few because it is Chaos we're talking about. Chaos Warhounds, in my opinion, C tier. There are a handful of matches where you will bring these guys just because they're cheaper. And you just don't care for poison. Maybe you're just looking to disrupt. Generally, though, they are less popular than their poison brethren, who are better for running down skirmish cav, better for supporting knights or other monsters in sustained combat because poison is just such a good debuff. So really, Warhounds are there if you need to cut a few corners, make some room in your army. But Poison Warhounds is a unit you'll almost always bring. And so that's why we're seeing them at A, while normal Warhounds are at C. Moving up in the line of cheapness, we do have generic Trolls. Pretty bad unit for Chaos, in my opinion. You're almost never going to bring these guys, if ever. These guys border on F tier for me, but they're not quite as terrible as the Manticore, who is going to get an F tier for me. You know what though, the Manticore's not that bad for Chaos. There are actually niche purposes for this, so I'm actually not going to put it at F. For once, they're not. Chaos is not going to have the Manticore at F, despite the fact that I put it at F for other before. I've considered F before. So to get back to Trolls real quick, low leadership, of course, non-existent armor, decent weapon stats, but realistically, as Chaos, your biggest investments are going to be your infantry and your big monsters. Trolls don't fall into either category. Plus, your lord's probably costing like a 6th of your army cost, so you just don't have the money to waste on Trolls. And the way, for example, Greenskins might have the money to spend on Trolls, or even Norska might, for example, depending on the build. Doesn't mean you can't make Trolls work, but realistically, you're not really going to try. It's very difficult to try to keep them in the fight. Oftentimes, as Chaos, your lord is going to be meandering around somewhere else. These guys can work with stacked on top of Aspiring Champions, but Aspiring Champions themselves are not that great of a unit, which hurts. And yeah, Sarthrel or Kolek, who are the prime choices for Lord, are usually not with your army. So they're usually running amok somewhere by themselves or with a small goon squad. So Trolls do not get that leadership support there. That really drops them to D, if not F tier. As much as I want to put them at D, I almost feel like these guys are an F because you're never going to bring them. And here's another reason you're never going to bring them, is because of the Armored Trolls. And Armored Trolls, in my opinion, do deserve, maybe even as... I look at Chosen with Grey Weapons, yeah, no, they're not a C tier. They're a D tier. But they deserve a D. A D, upper D, lower C. Why? They do have niche builds. You can combo them with Archeon to get that extra 4 leadership and immunity psychology. You can get the Encourage Aura from something like Aspiring Champions. Their armor values mean they don't suffer as much from missile play, which in turn means they don't break as easily. They don't take that much damage. They stick around a little longer. They do cost more than normal Trolls, but it's in certain cases worth it. And these guys can, I think, pay for themselves in specific niche builds, so they get a D. Manticore, similarly, very niche unit, but being your only, and this, it really boils down to Chaos's roster being so bare bones and limited. Manticores being one of your only flying options, the fact that Chaos has dog crap and dire options means that the Manticore is sometimes your only choice for trying to contest or deny the skies. If you need to harass your opponent, especially like Gyrocopter or something, Manticore might be your only real choice, unfortunately. So, yeah, it gets a D tier for that. Now, I still hate the unit. It still rampages way too easily. It is not a reliable unit at all. But it can help disrupt backlines. It can provide some cheap terror. And the way Chaos plays, it can actually be a valuable unit in certain cases. As much as I hate the unit. But I think there are a few niche cases. Against Dwarves especially, I like this unit. And there are a few other options. Against Skaven, I've seen it used, though not to great effect, in my experience. But you can bring it in certain matchups for some results. And really, it comes down to the fact that Chaos does not have cheap backline disrupt, much like the Exalted Hero, who I was talking earlier. For 800 gold, you can throw him on, or I think it's 800. Throw him on a horse, use him for backline harass. It's kind of the Manticore. It's one of your cheap, quote unquote, backline harass options. Chaos Spawn, who I'm actually so much in the mentality of old Chaos Spawn, who do cost as the same as armored trolls, but they actually no longer do. They are cheaper now. Are also not very good in my opinion. These guys are actually kind of get F tier. The only thing Chaos Spawn does well is kill infantry. Squishy infantry. Chaos doesn't have a problem with that. Marauders, Chaos Warriors, Mirror Guard, Chosen, Chaos Knights, delete squishy infantry. You have Burning Head, which deletes squishy infantry. You have Chariots, which run over squishy infantry. All of that do the job far better. This is like the Arc of Sotek, which is for the lizards being a dog crap unit for a specific purpose, or Fire Leech Bolas for the lizards. There's just so much redundancy in a specific role in the Chaos roster that the Chaos one just falls off. They'd have to be much cheaper in my opinion, or bring something unique to the table, like their Regiment Renowned Brethren, to be viable. But normally, don't bother. It's just not worth it. Which just gets on to Dragon Ogre, or actually Giants. Giant is going to get a D tier. I know it has some usage in the some limited usage I've seen actually in the Greenskin matchup, and some usage in the Vampire Count matchup. Versus Vampire Count's obviously a decent deterrent against Terrorgeists, can help beat down Blood Knights, that sort of thing. Versus Greenskins, who don't have the greatest missile pressure and tend to invest in Black Orcs because they need to counter your elite armored infantry. In those situations, the Giant actually performs relatively well because it can provide the terror you need to break enemy cheap trash mobs, goblins, that sort of thing. It actually provides a good smackdown against Black Orcs, and you can park it on some of your elite infantry or even decent infantry like Chaos Warriors to really go to Pound Town on your opponent. And if your opponent brings an Arachnox or something against the Giant can return the favor and hit relatively efficiently on a budget. And obviously you can bring a Shaggoth, and the Shaggoth is a much better tool in most cases, but I think the Giant has a handful of these niche applications where it's high HP, high leadership, and monsters' weapon strength do come into play. Which does bring us on to the Dragon Ogres, which in my eye is another unit I love. I'm going to put them at A tier. Low armor is definitely the downside. They're incredibly expensive. Stats are solid. High melee defense, not the greatest melee attack, but they do get bonus for large. They are very expensive. That's really the biggest downside to these bad boys. But I like them in certain matchups. Against Empire, for example, which will often invest in Demigryphs, these guys can do work. They can kick the teeth in of, say, Reichsguard or Demigryph Knights. They can do some good work there. Oftentimes, Empire will invest in AP shooting, which is then wasted on the Dragon Ogres who don't have armor. There are a few niche. It really comes down to niche purposes where these guys do counteract heavy cav, and to a lesser extent can contain big monsters somewhat effectively. You know what? I think I'm a little overzealous. As much as I like these guys, it's niche matchups where I like them. So I think B tier is probably a fairer point. They're kind of like Chaos Chosen with Halberds. There are a handful of matchups where they are very strong, but it's not a unit you're going to bring anywhere near in every matchup. It's just a handful of matchups where you'll bring them. Usually as an auxiliary unit, maybe like one of them. And the other thing is, if you're going to bring them, you'll generally bring the Regiment of Renown before you bring Dragon Ogres, and that's another limiting factor. Finally, we do have the Shaggoth. This has been kind of a staple unit for the Chaos roster for ages, and it's actually going to get S tier as well. Kind of uncontested for the anti-large pound town role. Yes, there are other anti-large units or anti-large options in the Chaos roster. You've got, of course, Horsemen, Horsemasters, Dragon Ogres, Chosen with Halberds, Warriors with Halberds, that sort of thing. But really, the Shaggoths have been king there. You bring Kolek and a Shaggoth, and you got a beastly mob. And, yeah, they're great. There are a few matchups where you won't bring them. But realistically, they can compete in nearly every, if not every, matchup that Chaos has. And oftentimes, if you don't bring Kolek, you will still bring a Shaggoth. Because, hey, why not? It's a strong option. Obviously not great against like Wood Elves or Empire or Dwarves, but vast majority of matchups these guys can shine and do shine. And yeah, they're good. They're an S tier. Version around Chaos Spawn, in my opinion, a stable. I'll put them at. It's a tough one. I actually really like these guys. I probably put them somewhere between B and C tier. Put them at low B, high C. They have armor sundering. That's the biggest benefit here. They have some physical resist, which helps make them tankier. It's nice. The biggest selling point on these bad boys is their armor sundering. You stack them on top of Chosen, you stack them on top of Chaos Warriors, Marauders, Knights, whatever. These guys debuff the target, make your non-AP that much more effective. And like I said before, Chaos has a lot of very strong non-AP options. These guys just synergize so well with that. They are unbreakable, which means they will fight to the bitter end, providing that armor sundering till the last moment, which is actually huge. Oftentimes your opponent will not focus this unit down, and if you have literally one spawn on 1 HP, swinging its ridiculous tentacles and degenerate arms around, slapping one enemy soldier, that is enough to armor sunder the entire unit and can make a unit like Chosen or Chaos Warriors or whatever perform that much better in that fight. And that is why this unit makes a B tier, despite the fact that it itself is not great. Like by itself, it's a slightly souped up spawn. Like, yeah, it performs a little better against armor because of armor sundering, but yeah, it's not great. But really, the synergy is where this unit shines. If it snares a unit, if it prevents, oftentimes you'll see opponents try to plow through your line maybe with some sort of monster or whatever. These guys can slow it down with their high mass, make it more vulnerable to your non-AP, make it more vulnerable to, for example, Marauder Horsemen, that sort of thing. Just a lovely unit. I really do enjoy them. And finally, we do have the Summoners of Rage, who easy A tier for me, bordering on S. There are some units in the Chaos roster I'm very fond of. These guys are one of them. They've got rank 9 stats and a free Chain Lightning that they charge up over 60 seconds of melee combat. It's rare that you don't get the Chain Lightning off. Free Chain Lightning is nice. Chain Lightning is not a great spell in and of itself, but if you get it free and you happen to get a good one, it can delete entire armies. Even if you don't get a great one, it can still do some damage and can help mess up mobs, which is just super valuable. And the unit's high combat stats as well as magic damage is just so good. You need to deal with like Dragon Princes. These guys will hard counter them. They will kick their teeth in. Once again, they're good against factions like Empire, for example. So they have these like niche applications. They're not great in every match, but there are a handful. Where they really shine, and more so than Dragon Ogres. If you're going to bring Dragon Ogres to a fight, it is going to be Summoners of Rage first and foremost. And I think for that, they deserve an A tier. So that is my Warriors of Chaos roster. Hopefully you guys did enjoy. Hopefully you did find it entertaining and fun. And if you disagree or agree or have your own thoughts and opinions, certainly be sure to leave them down below. I'd love to hear them, love to read them. A lot of times I do take your guys' input and then try out some new strats, try out new units. There's some stuff I just don't even think of, and you guys come up with, and I'm like, wow, why didn't I think of that? Well, I just didn't. And oftentimes I'm just completely wrong about units. So, yeah, be sure to let me know. I'd honestly love to hear your guys' input and thoughts and opinions, as always. Obviously, pretty hyped for the upcoming patch, for the upcoming DLC. Should be a lot of fun, and definitely excited to see what it brings. Chaos most likely is just going to stay stuck where it is until Warhammer 3, but what can you do? So, hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next one. Wyvern out.